In the past, warfare was a visible, tangible experience. We could see the planes in the sky, the tanks rolling across the battlefield, and the soldiers on the front lines. Nations declared wars, and the world watched as military forces clashed in open confrontations. But today, the nature of conflict has changed dramatically. The most significant battles are no longer fought in plain sight. They are waged in secrecy, behind closed doors, and in places where we are least likely to notice. This shift has created what we now refer to as a shadow war. These wars are invisible to the average person. They don't make headlines, and they don't dominate the news cycles in the way traditional wars did. Instead, they unfold in the digital world, in the depths of the internet, and across networks of influence that operate far from public scrutiny. Here, the enemy isn't always a nation with a military but can be a faceless organization or even a collection of anonymous actors. Consider cyberattacks. They don't involve tanks or soldiers storming through a border, yet they can cripple entire economies, disrupt vital infrastructures, and even steal sensitive information that can threaten national security. Unlike traditional warfare, these digital attacks can happen in the blink of an eye, with no visible signs of physical harm, but the consequences can be just as severe, if not more so. Nations are no longer fighting on battlefields but in code, where the lines of defense are drawn in firewalls and encryption, and the weapons are malware and ransomware. Moreover, this invisible nature of shadow wars has created a sense of uncertainty. It's difficult to pinpoint the source of the conflict, who is truly responsible, or what the true objectives are. One country might suffer from a destabilizing propaganda campaign or a financial crisis, and yet the instigators might remain hidden, their identities shielded by layers of deception. Information warfare, often through disinformation campaigns or hacking into media outlets, is another form of invisible conflict that influences public opinion and political outcomes without the public even realizing they are being manipulated. In this type of conflict, traditional markers of war, such as declarations of military engagement or visible destruction, are absent. The battlefields have become vast and often uncharted. The fights occur in the realms of data, media, and diplomacy, where subtle moves can shift allegiances and impact international relations. This invisibility complicates efforts to respond effectively. A cyberattack, for instance, might not immediately be recognized as an act of war, and yet it can have far-reaching consequences, causing more damage than a conventional military assault. The concept of an invisible war also creates psychological pressure. Citizens and governments live in a constant state of anxiety, never fully knowing when or where the next attack might come from. The sense of security is eroded, as adversaries can strike from anywhere, often without warning and with no visible markers. It's a warfare of constant vigilance, where threats can materialize from unexpected sources at any given moment. This sense of uncertainty, in many ways, becomes a weapon in itself, as the inability to predict or understand the enemy's moves leads to instability and fear. Ultimately, invisible conflicts challenge our understanding of warfare. They force us to rethink our security strategies and our approach to international relations. They ask the question, how do we fight an enemy we cannot see? How do we defend against a war that operates in the dark corners of technology and politics? The era of invisible warfare is upon us, and it is a challenge we must learn to face head-on. In the landscape of modern warfare, overt military engagements with large, visible armies have increasingly given way to more subtle and covert operations. In the shadows, behind the veil of diplomacy and international law, powerful nations, organizations, and individuals now engage in a new kind of warfare, one that operates in the realm of secrecy and subterfuge. This new form of warfare is marked by the use of covert operations, where strategies are built on clandestine actions and hidden agendas. One of the primary elements of a shadow war is the reliance on covert operations. These are deliberate actions undertaken by governments, intelligence agencies, or even non-state actors to achieve strategic objectives without being detected or formally acknowledged. The tactics used in these operations are designed to be undetectable and to avoid direct confrontation. Unlike traditional warfare, where battles are fought in the open, covert operations happen behind the scenes. sometimes even without the knowledge of the public or other international players. A key aspect of these covert operations is the use of proxy forces. Proxy wars, which are indirect conflicts where one party supports another group to fight on their behalf, have become a prominent feature of modern warfare. These wars are fought through militias, mercenaries, and insurgent groups that act as surrogates for a state or power. The benefit of this approach is that the supporting country or actor can achieve their objectives while maintaining plausible deniability, thus avoiding the political and diplomatic consequences of direct involvement. For example, nations might provide funding, weapons, or training to rebel factions in a foreign country in order to destabilize a regime or influence its political direction, all without ever showing their hand. Another facet of covert operations is the manipulation of intelligence gathering. Today's espionage, much like its historical predecessors, thrives in the shadows. The modern intelligence landscape is dominated by surveillance, hacking, and covert recruitment. Governments and intelligence agencies deploy spies to infiltrate enemy organizations, gather sensitive information, and sabotage adversaries from within. The information gathered through these covert means often shapes diplomatic strategies, military decisions, and even economic policies, all without the knowledge of the broader public. In some cases, intelligence operations are so secretive that the very existence of an operation may not be confirmed until many years later, if ever. Cyber warfare also plays a central role in modern covert operations. Unlike traditional methods, cyberattacks allow for an anonymous and remote form of conflict. A single, sophisticated cyberattack can disable an adversary's power grid, disrupt communications, steal military secrets, or manipulate financial markets, all without the victim ever knowing the identity of the attacker. These cyber operations are not limited to state actors. Hacktivists, criminal organizations, and even corporate rivals often engage in digital subterfuge to further their goals, creating a vast web of invisible attacks that is incredibly difficult to trace and respond to. Furthermore, economic warfare is an increasingly popular tactic in these shadow conflicts. Economic sanctions, trade wars, and financial destabilization can all be used as weapons in a covert operation. By leveraging a nation's financial influence, an actor can undermine an opponent's economy, disrupt supply chains, or cause inflation and job losses, all of which can destabilize a country without a single shot being fired. Nations can exert immense pressure on one another by manipulating access to vital resources, strategically placing tariffs, or imposing embargoes, all in the shadows of the global economy. The resulting economic damage is often felt deeply by citizens, but the perpetrators remain shielded from retaliation or direct confrontation. In the world of covert warfare, disinformation and psychological manipulation are also powerful tools. Through carefully crafted media campaigns, misinformation, and propaganda, actors can alter the course of elections, create divisions within a society, and sow distrust among a population. In a digital age, disinformation spreads rapidly, often with little ability for the public to discern fact from fiction. A well-placed piece of false information can create chaos, shift political landscapes, or fuel conflict between groups, all while remaining hidden behind layers of digital manipulation. The war for hearts and minds is fought in the shadows of the media, where truth is sometimes the first casualty of the conflict. What makes these tactics so effective is the lack of accountability. In the traditional sense of war, military forces are subject to international law, rules of engagement, and oversight. But covert operations operate in a legal gray area, often falling outside the reach of international norms. The use of proxy forces, cyberattacks, and disinformation campaigns creates a situation where nations can conduct harmful actions without being directly responsible for the consequences. This ambiguity allows for greater flexibility in pursuing strategic objectives while avoiding direct confrontation. Covert operations are not only limited to state actors. They are employed by a wide array of actors, including multinational corporations, insurgent groups, and even terrorist organizations. These actors, though not operating on the same scale as nation-states, utilize many of the same tactics to achieve their aims. For example, Private corporations may engage in economic sabotage or espionage to steal trade secrets, while non-state actors may use proxy wars to advance political or ideological causes. This broadening of the scope of covert operations means that the battleground is no longer confined to geopolitical boundaries. It is fought across industries, sectors, and regions. Ultimately, the use of covert operations and tactics in a shadow war has changed the very nature of conflict. With no clear front lines, no visible markers of aggression, and no formal declarations of war, these operations have created a new kind of warfare, one where strategy is dictated by secrecy, and success is measured not by visible victories, but by the ability to operate in the shadows, unseen and unaccountable. The very complexity and subtlety of these tactics make them all the more dangerous and effective, as their true impact may not be felt until it is too late. One of the most significant and dangerous characteristics of a shadow war is the inherent ambiguity that surrounds it. In traditional warfare, the cause of conflict is often clear, as are the identities of the combatants. Wars are declared between states or recognized entities, and their boundaries, both physical and political, are defined. Military forces are deployed, battles are fought, and outcomes, while uncertain, are visible. But in a shadow war, things are far murkier. The very nature of the conflict is shrouded in uncertainty, and this ambiguity makes it far more difficult to navigate, understand, and respond to. The first layer of ambiguity comes from the identity of the actors involved. In conventional wars, the belligerents are usually states or well-known groups with clear motivations and objectives. The adversaries are identifiable, and their actions can be tracked, making the task of diplomacy and negotiation more straightforward. In contrast, shadow wars are fought by a diverse range of actors. These can include state-sponsored cybercriminals, non-state actors like insurgent groups or militant organizations, corporate entities seeking economic advantage, or even anonymous hackers and rogue operatives. These actors may have conflicting motives or work across borders and without any formal recognition, often making it impossible to pinpoint precisely who is responsible for any given action. In many cases, the parties engaged in a shadow war go to great lengths to obscure their identities, using proxies, cyber tools, and disinformation campaigns to mask their involvement. As a result, governments, intelligence agencies, and the public are left to speculate about the true source of the conflict, leading to confusion and an inability to act decisively. Unlike conventional wars where flags are flown and borders are marked, shadow wars operate in a world where faceless entities engage in battles that are not necessarily confined to one territory or domain. This lack of clarity forces policymakers into a state of constant vigilance, as they cannot be sure who their enemies are or what their next move might be. The ambiguity in these wars also extends to the nature of the conflict itself. What defines a shadow war is that it often does not take the form of traditional military combat. Instead, it is a war of intelligence, influence, and subversion. Cyberattacks, propaganda campaigns, economic sanctions, and political manipulation are all part of this silent battle. However, the boundaries of what constitutes an act of war are not always clear. A cyberattack that disrupts a country's power grid or financial system might be a strategic maneuver in a shadow war, but under international law, it might not be classified as an act of war. Similarly, economic sabotage or disinformation might destabilize a government or society, but there are no clear rules for when such actions escalate into full-scale military engagement. This uncertainty about what constitutes an act of war can leave nations vulnerable, as they may not recognize the severity of an attack until it is too late. Even more complicating is the uncertainty about the objectives of the conflict. In traditional warfare, it is often clear what the goal of the war is, whether it is territorial conquest, regime change, or national defense. There are tangible objectives, even if they are subject to change. However, in a shadow war, the objectives can be nebulous and difficult to discern. For example, an adversary might launch a disinformation campaign to destabilize a government or create confusion in the political landscape. But the exact goal of this operation might not be immediately obvious. Is the goal to bring down a specific leader, to influence an election, or to weaken the political system in general? These goals are often hidden behind layers of deception and manipulation, making it difficult for any nation or entity to develop a clear strategy for counteraction. Further complicating this ambiguity is the evolving nature of the conflict. Shadow wars do not follow a predictable pattern or timeline. They do not follow conventional rules of engagement. One moment, a government might be dealing with a cyber attack that disrupts critical infrastructure. The next, it is embroiled in a trade war, facing economic sanctions, or struggling to manage a flood of disinformation aimed at its citizens. Unlike traditional wars, which have distinct phases and progressions, shadow wars often operate in a state of continuous flux. There is no clear starting point, and there is rarely a definitive end. Even when one conflict appears to be resolved, the underlying tensions may still exist, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to flare up again in a different form. This constant state of ambiguity and uncertainty has profound effects on both the psychology of decision-making and the strategic responses of nations. Policymakers are forced to make decisions with incomplete or conflicting information, which can lead to delayed reactions, missteps, or overreactions. In the absence of clarity about the identity of the adversary, the nature of the attack, or the objectives at stake, countries may struggle to determine the appropriate course of action. Should they retaliate militarily in response to a cyber attack? Should they impose sanctions or engage in diplomatic talks? The lack of clear answers leads to a heightened state of confusion and indecision, which can be exploited by adversaries seeking to gain an upper hand. Moreover, the uncertainty around these wars can also lead to a lack of trust among international actors. Nations that are unsure of who their enemies are, or what specific objectives those enemies may have, may find it difficult to form alliances or cooperate effectively with other states. Diplomatic relationships become strained as trust erodes in the face of constant ambiguity. Countries may begin to act out of self-interest, hoarding resources, or even engaging in their own covert operations to protect themselves, further fueling instability. The absence of a clear victor or identifiable conclusion to these conflicts also means that their long-term consequences can be even more severe. Shadow wars often leave no obvious scars. There are no victory parades, no treaties signed, no clear end to the fighting. The damage, while sometimes subtle, can be far-reaching and insidious. Over time, these hidden conflicts erode trust between nations, destabilize economies, and disrupt societies in ways that are difficult to quantify or repair. Their effects may not be immediately apparent, but their influence lingers long after the initial shockwaves have passed. In essence, the ambiguity and uncertainty of shadow wars create a uniquely challenging environment. This absence of clarity on so many fronts, the identity of the enemy, the nature of the conflict, the objectives at stake, makes these wars both difficult to navigate and even more dangerous. Nations and international organizations are forced to adapt to a constantly shifting landscape, where every move is uncertain and the stakes are impossibly high. This uncertainty becomes a weapon in itself, as the very lack of visibility and predictability makes it almost impossible to develop effective countermeasures. The result is a world in which security, stability, and peace seem elusive, and the future is clouded by the shadows of hidden conflict. One of the defining features of a shadow war is its ability to remain hidden from public view, while simultaneously having far-reaching and potentially devastating effects. These conflicts are often waged in the background, out of sight of the global community, yet the consequences of these silent wars are anything but inconsequential. Whether it's through cyber attacks, economic manipulation, or disinformation campaigns, shadow wars have the power to destabilize governments, undermine economies, disrupt societies, and alter the course of history, all without a single shot being fired or a formal declaration of war made. The most dangerous aspect of silent wars is the unseen damage they cause. Unlike traditional wars, where destruction is often visible, buildings are leveled, cities are bombed, and the human cost is evident, the harm caused by shadow wars is not immediately apparent. Cyber attacks can cripple critical infrastructure, yet the public may remain unaware of the extent of the damage until it is too late. Economic sanctions can destabilize a nation's economy, but the immediate effects may not be felt for years, leading to long-term repercussions that ripple through global markets. Similarly, The manipulation of public opinion through disinformation can have widespread social consequences, sparking divisions, inciting violence, or altering the outcome of elections without the public ever realizing they were targeted. In the age of digital interconnectedness, the reach of a shadow war is no longer confined to a specific region, state, or conflict zone. It is a global phenomenon capable of affecting anyone, anywhere. A single cyber attack on a nation's power grid can create a cascading effect that impacts global supply chains, disrupts financial markets, and causes ripple effects far beyond the borders of the country that is targeted. Similarly, a campaign of disinformation aimed at one nation's elections can have ramifications that extend across continents, influencing the political landscape of other countries or undermining the trust between allies. The reach of these silent wars transcends geographical boundaries, making it possible for one attack to reverberate around the world, affecting a wide array of sectors, industries, and populations. The scope of these wars is also enhanced by the invisibility with which they unfold. Because these operations are carried out behind the scenes, governments and organizations may not immediately recognize when they are under attack. For example, a country might not know that its digital infrastructure has been compromised until the damage has already been done. Or, it may take years to fully understand the consequences of a series of economic sanctions that were quietly enacted to destabilize a rival nation's economy. Even more insidious is the use of disinformation, which can infiltrate media outlets, social platforms, and online forums without the target population being aware that they are being manipulated. This invisibility creates a dangerous environment where the effects of these silent wars can spread unnoticed, often until the damage is irreparable. Silent wars are also unique in the way they compromise the security of individuals, organizations, and governments without their knowledge. A cyber attack might infiltrate government databases, steal sensitive military intelligence, or manipulate public opinion, all without the targeted entity realizing it is happening. In some cases, the targeted parties may only become aware of the attack long after the fact, when the damage has already been done. The impact of these attacks is often far-reaching, not just for the targeted nation or organization, but also for the global community as a whole. Information is power, and when this information is compromised or manipulated in covert ways, it can have widespread implications for both national security and international relations. One of the most profound and potentially catastrophic effects of silent wars is the undermining of trust between nations, institutions, and individuals. Trust is the bedrock of diplomacy, international cooperation, and peacebuilding. But when governments, corporations, or other entities engage in covert operations, whether they are economic, political, or technological, it erodes this trust and creates an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia. Countries may begin to distrust each other, even when they are not directly involved in any particular conflict. This growing distrust leads to the breakdown of cooperation and the collapse of alliances, further exacerbating global instability. In a world where shadow wars are increasingly common, it becomes more difficult to tell friend from foe. And this uncertainty can destabilize international relations, making it harder to form alliances or coordinate on critical global issues like climate change, trade, or public health. The psychological toll of silent wars cannot be underestimated either. The constant fear of being targeted by an invisible adversary has an impact on both the political leadership of nations and their citizens. In countries where disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks are common, there is a constant underlying anxiety about the potential for unseen attacks. Governments may become overly paranoid, implementing measures that restrict civil liberties in the name of security. Citizens may begin to distrust their own media, institutions, and leaders as they question the authenticity of the information they are receiving. This sense of fear and uncertainty can have destabilizing effects on a society, as it breeds division, confusion, and a lack of confidence in the systems that are supposed to protect and guide it. The long-term consequences of these silent wars are often far more severe than immediate, visible impacts. Unlike traditional wars, where the end of a conflict is often marked by a clear victory or defeat, the outcomes of a shadow war are much more diffuse and less quantifiable. A nation might not lose territory or experience a military defeat, but its economy could be weakened by sanctions, its political system could be destabilized by covert manipulation, and its social fabric could be torn apart by disinformation. Over time, these covert attacks can lead to a slow but steady erosion of a nation's strength and influence, both domestically and internationally. The war may not be won or lost on the battlefield, but it can have long-lasting consequences for the nation's future, its alliances, and its global standing. Even though these silent wars are waged with tactics that are not easily visible, the overall impact on society is undeniable. As the digital age progresses, the boundaries of war have shifted. Conflict is no longer limited to the traditional battlefields, where soldiers face off against one another in the open. Instead, the battlefield is often hidden in cyberspace, in boardrooms, in diplomatic negotiations, and on social media platforms. The tools of war are more subtle than ever before, but their impact is just as profound. In fact, the ability to wage war in such a covert and invisible manner makes these silent conflicts even more dangerous, as they operate without the clear signs of warfare and without the ability to easily recognize or respond to them. In essence, silent wars have the capacity to reach far beyond the immediate context of the conflict itself, often causing effects that reverberate globally. Their covert nature allows them to remain hidden from public scrutiny, but the consequences of these invisible battles are both profound and lasting. While the traditional face of war has been altered, the impact of silent wars on global stability, trust, and security remains just as potent, if not more so. The ability to wage war without detection is not a sign of strength, but rather an indication of the new realities of conflict, where the most devastating attacks may be the ones we cannot see. Shadow wars present a profound ethical dilemma that challenges not only the traditional notions of warfare, but also the moral frameworks through which nations, organizations, and individuals operate in the global arena. Conventional warfare has long been governed by international laws and ethical principles, such as the Geneva Conventions, which aim to limit the suffering caused by war and to protect civilians, prisoners of war, and the environment. However, shadow wars operate in a murky space where these established ethical boundaries are often ignored or circumvented entirely. The very nature of these covert conflicts makes it difficult to determine the morality of actions being taken as they unfold in the shadows, outside of public view, and with a lack of accountability. At the heart of the ethical dilemma in shadow wars is the question of justification. In traditional warfare, the principles of just war theory are often invoked to determine whether a conflict is morally justified. Just war theory considers whether the cause of war is just, whether the war is waged by legitimate authority, and whether the means used in war are proportionate to the end goal. However, in a shadow war, where the perpetrators are often hidden and the objectives unclear, it is nearly impossible to apply these ethical standards. For example, the use of cyberattacks may be justified by one actor as a defensive measure or an act of retribution, but it could lead to widespread civilian suffering, financial loss, and critical infrastructure damage. In the absence of clear definitions of what constitutes a legitimate target or acceptable collateral damage, the line between justifiable action and unlawful aggression becomes blurred. In the realm of disinformation and propaganda, the ethical questions become even more complex. Disinformation campaigns can be incredibly effective in manipulating public opinion, sowing division, and destabilizing governments. They may be carried out under the guise of promoting national interests or protecting security, but they often do so at the expense of truth, transparency, and the rights of citizens. The question arises, is it ethical to deceive an entire population for political or strategic gain, even if it means undermining the democratic processes that those same governments claim to protect? Furthermore, when disinformation is used to interfere in the internal affairs of another country, whether by influencing elections, inciting unrest, or creating social divisions, the ethical concerns become even more pronounced. These actions not only affect the sovereignty of the target nation but also raise questions about the responsibility of those who propagate lies, knowing that the consequences could result in harm to innocent civilians or destabilize an entire region. The use of proxy forces in shadow wars also raises significant ethical concerns. Proxy warfare allows states and non-state actors to achieve their objectives without directly involving themselves in the conflict. By supporting insurgent groups, militias, or mercenaries, the primary actor can achieve its goals while maintaining plausible deniability. However, this creates a situation where the true nature of responsibility is obscured. Proxy forces may engage in acts of violence, torture, and war crimes, yet the supporting state may escape direct accountability. Additionally, proxy actors often operate outside the bounds of international law, engaging in indiscriminate violence against civilians or targeting non-combatants. This creates an ethical conundrum for governments that sponsor such forces. How can a state claim to uphold human rights and international norms while secretly supporting groups that engage in atrocities? Furthermore, when the conflict between proxy forces leads to civilian suffering and displacement, the question arises: who is morally responsible for the harm inflicted on innocent people? The ethical concerns surrounding cyber warfare are also central to the dilemma of shadow wars. Cyberattacks have the potential to cause significant disruption without any physical violence. A single cyberattack can bring down a power grid, shut down financial systems, or steal sensitive personal or corporate data. While these actions may be framed as acts of defense or retaliation, the consequences can be far-reaching and devastating. When a cyberattack is launched against a nation's critical infrastructure, it often has indirect effects on ordinary citizens who may have nothing to do with the political conflict at hand. For instance, a cyberattack on a hospital system may prevent patients from receiving critical care, or it could disrupt food supply chains, leading to shortages and economic hardships for vulnerable populations. The ethical question becomes: how do we weigh the need for security against the potential harm to innocent civilians? Furthermore, the anonymity of cyberattacks complicates the issue of accountability, as attackers can often hide behind layers of encryption and proxies. This lack of transparency makes it difficult to assess the morality of these actions or to hold perpetrators accountable for the damage they cause. Another ethical issue that arises in shadow wars is the challenge of civilian protection. Traditional warfare, despite its brutality, at least recognizes the concept of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The Geneva Conventions and other international laws are designed to protect civilians from the direct impacts of armed conflict. However, in shadow wars, where the boundaries between military and civilian spheres are often blurred, it becomes difficult to uphold this principle. Cyberattacks and economic sabotage, for example, affect civilians directly, often in ways that are far less visible, but equally harmful. When civilian infrastructure is targeted, such as healthcare systems, energy grids, or banking systems, it is often the most vulnerable members of society who suffer the most. This raises the question of whether it is ethically justifiable to target infrastructure that supports the well-being of civilians, even if the intention is to disrupt an adversary's ability to function. In this context, the distinction between combatant and non-combatant becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Furthermore, the ethical implications of state sovereignty come into play in shadow wars. International law is built around the idea that states have the right to govern their own affairs without interference from external forces. However, shadow wars often involve direct interference in the internal politics of other nations, undermining their sovereignty. This may occur through cyber espionage, political subversion, or economic manipulation. The question arises: is it ethically acceptable for one state or non-state actor to infringe on another nation's sovereignty in the pursuit of national interests or geopolitical goals? Is there a moral justification for interfering in the domestic affairs of another country, even if it is framed as a defense against an external threat or as an effort to protect national security? Finally, the lack of accountability in shadow wars raises a significant ethical dilemma. In traditional wars, international bodies like the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, ICC, exist to hold perpetrators accountable for war crimes, violations of human rights, and other illegal actions. However, in shadow wars, where much of the conflict occurs in secret or through covert means, accountability becomes a distant ideal. The use of proxy forces, anonymous cyberattacks, and disinformation campaigns allows the perpetrators to remain in the shadows, making it difficult to attribute blame or seek justice. This lack of accountability not only allows unethical actions to go unpunished, but also fosters a climate in which these tactics can be used with impunity. Without the threat of consequences, the ethical limits of shadow warfare are continually pushed, and actions that would be considered unacceptable in a conventional war are normalized. In essence, the ethical dilemma of shadow wars forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about morality in the context of modern conflict. As these covert battles continue to unfold behind the scenes, it becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile the actions taken with the ethical standards we claim to uphold. The lack of transparency, accountability, and adherence to traditional rules of warfare complicates the moral landscape, creating a situation where the line between right and wrong becomes obscured. As nations and non-state actors continue to engage in these hidden wars, the ethical implications of their actions must be carefully examined, as the consequences of these decisions will shape the future of international relations, conflict, and justice. While the immediate effects of shadow wars may not be as overtly visible or devastating as those of traditional wars, their long-term impact can be far-reaching and far more insidious. The quiet, often unseen nature of these conflicts means that the true consequences may take years, if not decades, to fully materialize. The prolonged and ongoing nature of shadow wars, coupled with their ability to infiltrate multiple domains, such as political systems, economies, and social structures, ensures that their ramifications can alter the course of nations, regional stability, and even global power dynamics. One of the most significant long-term impacts of shadow wars is the erosion of political stability. A shadow war's covert tactics are often designed to undermine the legitimacy and authority of governments, weaken their control over their territories, and create conditions of political chaos. Disinformation campaigns, for example, can erode public trust in political institutions, leading to the destabilization of democratic processes and fueling political polarization. When citizens lose confidence in their leaders and institutions, it can lead to widespread unrest, protests, and even calls for regime change. In this way, the effects of a shadow war can gradually weaken the internal cohesion of a country, leaving it vulnerable to external manipulation and internal disintegration. This political instability can persist long after the covert operations have ceased, as the wounds inflicted on the social and political fabric of a society can take years to heal. Additionally, the psychological toll of shadow wars can have a long-lasting effect on individuals and entire populations. In the case of disinformation and media manipulation, the psychological damage can be profound. Citizens may begin to question the reliability of their own media, sources of information, and even their peers. A sense of collective paranoia and distrust can permeate society, creating divisions that can persist long after the immediate conflict has ended. The uncertainty about the nature of the attack and the identity of the adversary adds to the trauma. Without a clear enemy or an identifiable resolution, the public may live in a state of continuous fear and anxiety, unsure of who is pulling the strings or what is happening behind the scenes. This fractured social trust and heightened sense of insecurity are not easy to mend, and they can significantly hinder the process of societal recovery in the aftermath of a shadow war. The economic consequences of shadow wars can also have a lasting effect on both the targeted nations and the global economy. Economic warfare, in the form of sanctions, cyberattacks, or trade disruptions, can cripple a nation's financial system and damage its long-term growth prospects. Cyberattacks targeting financial institutions can result in the loss of billions of dollars, destabilizing economies and eroding investor confidence. The knock-on effects of these attacks can create a ripple effect across the global market, especially when critical sectors like energy, technology, or communications are targeted. For example, a cyber attack on a major oil exporter could lead to global fuel shortages, price spikes, and disruptions in the supply chain that affect other industries and nations. The financial and logistical challenges created by such disruptions can last for years, as nations attempt to rebuild their economies and repair the damage done. Furthermore, economic sabotage can also target essential infrastructure, such as transportation systems, energy grids, and healthcare systems, ultimately impacting the broader population in ways that may not be immediately apparent. The gradual decay of these systems, particularly in countries with weaker infrastructure, can result in years of underdevelopment, reduced productivity, and stunted economic growth. In addition, the cost of rebuilding after these types of attacks can further strain national budgets, diverting resources away from social programs, infrastructure improvements, or long-term investment in the nation's future. The economic damage caused by shadow wars can persist long after the immediate conflict ends, as the rebuilding process often takes decades, and the financial scars left behind affect future generations. The international power balance is another area where shadow wars can have lasting effects. These covert conflicts are often designed to shift the balance of power in favor of one nation or group of nations while weakening the influence of others. By targeting key areas of a rival's economy, government, or military, shadow wars can gradually weaken a nation's global standing, shifting regional and international power dynamics. Countries that engage in these wars may seek to weaken their adversaries, but the impact often extends far beyond the immediate conflict. For example, a state that loses significant economic or military power as a result of a covert attack may find it harder to maintain its influence in international organizations, trade negotiations, or security alliances. This shift in the global power structure can create a ripple effect, leading to new alignments, strategic partnerships, and shifts in global governance. The long-term consequences of these changes may not be immediately obvious, but over time, the erosion of established power dynamics can reshape entire regions and even the global order. Countries that were once seen as hegemonic may find themselves on the defensive, while rising powers may seize the opportunity to expand their influence. Finally, the impact of shadow wars on international law and norms cannot be overstated. As the tactics and methods employed in these covert conflicts continue to evolve, they increasingly challenge the existing frameworks that govern conflict, sovereignty, and accountability. Shadow wars often operate in a legal gray area, making it difficult to apply existing international laws, such as those that govern the conduct of war, the protection of civilians, or the use of force. The growing prevalence of these operations calls for a reevaluation of how international law can adapt to address the complexities of modern conflict. Without robust legal mechanisms to address these new forms of warfare, there is a risk that shadow wars will continue to undermine global stability and peace. In conclusion, the long-term impact of shadow wars is profound and multifaceted. These covert conflicts, while often hidden from view, have the potential to alter political, economic, and social landscapes in ways that are felt long after the operations themselves have ceased. The erosion of trust, destabilization of governments, weakening of economies, shifts in global power dynamics, and challenges to international law all contribute to a world where the aftermath of a shadow war is far from over. As the tactics of shadow warfare evolve, so too must our understanding of its lasting consequences and the strategies we employ to prevent or mitigate its damage. The full scope of the impact may only become clear with time, but the need for vigilance, cooperation, and adaptation is greater than ever.